So we're doing our really very, very brief run-up to Letters and Papers from Prison, overview of Bonhoeffer's theology. We've talked about his understanding of creation and fall. We talked about his Christology. And he was building on this foundation then as he continued with the church struggle. And the church struggle was not very successful. They did have a little shining moment at Barmen in 1934, in May of 1934, when they made this very clear confession that Jesus Christ alone is the one that they're going to obey in death and in life, whatever, and not other movements or forces or whatever that might appear in history. That was mostly authored by Karl Barth, as you probably know. Later on in that year came the Dahlem Declaration, which basically stated that the true evangelical church in Germany was the church that held to Barmen and did not compromise with the official church. Bonhoeffer held very firmly to both of those statements. He was quite a radical Dahlemite and really said there can be no compromise with the official church. And this was very difficult for pastors, young pastors who wanted to get a position, because you had to go to the consistory, that is to the committee that would authorize and certify you as a pastor in order to get a parish. But the church, the confessing church, then organized their own confessing, or their own preachers' seminaries, because I should mention that the system for educating pastors was they would get their theological degree at the university, then they would go to a preacher's seminary, so-called, to learn practical theology, to learn how to preach and do pastoral care, worship, all those things. And so the confessing church started their own, Michael?
Can you mention briefly the dilution of Lutheranism in Germany during that time, that there wasn't a strong Lutheran presence per se?
Well, yeah, there were, the situation in Germany was very complex. There were many territorial churches, Protestant churches. Some of them were Reformed, some of them were Lutheran, and some of them were Union. Bonhoeffer himself was a member of the Prussian Union, which had both Reformed and Lutheran. The confessional Lutherans, quote unquote, confessional Lutherans, would not stand with the Reformed in confessing against this German Christian heresy. That is, that the church ought to be molded by the prevailing culture, and that Christian obedience was obedience essentially to Hitler. Because some of the Lutherans were really adhering to that very extreme version of the two kingdoms theory, which I mentioned last time, that separated the two out as two separate revelations of God. And a few, like Hermann Sasse, would not go along with Barmen because he felt he could not make a confession with Christians with whom he did not have a stand in doctrinal agreement about the gospel. That is, with the Reformed. Bonhoeffer did not have that view at all. For him, both Lutheran and Reformed could make in good conscience and must make at that point a common confession against the heresy that threatened all of the churches. And that would put to one side, at least for now, the Reformed Lutheran difference. And what he would have done later with the Reformed Lutheran difference, I don't know. It's very clear that he's standing on the Lutheran side in his theological work. But he did not think this was the time now to continue this old 400-year-old conflict with the Reformed about the Lord's Supper, for example, or even about law gospel, which the Lutherans were doing vehemently after 1935 when Karl Barth wrote his famous essay, Gospel and Law. So he stands to one side from the Lutherans at that time. And at least the confessional, quote-unquote, Lutherans, who would not, who felt that the big task now was to counteract Karl Barth. And he said, that's absolutely crazy. We all got to stand together here against what is really threatening all of our churches. The Reformed aren't the enemy. Okay? So that was his view. Obviously, I sympathize with his view. His take on his particular situation. That's not to say that in another context, then it might be necessary really to look at that. But in his context, with the church utterly pressed against the wall, they had to stand together. Anyway, he was called to be the leader of one of these seminaries, which was eventually housed in a former school building in a rural area in Pomerania, eastern Germany, now Poland. The territory is now, that location is now within Poland. And this was at Finkenwalde. And there he was able to put into effect a curriculum to try to equip pastors so that they could stand against this heresy, so they could engage in this, what he called hand-to-hand combat against this spirit that had taken over not only Germany, but also German churches. And he knew that the traditional theology that they had gotten at the university was not going to help, including this kind of Lutheran, it's called Neo-Lutheranism, that they had imbibed, which separated the two kingdoms so cleanly and almost totally. So there he engaged in a study of the Synoptic Gospels, especially three parts of the Synoptic Gospels: the call to follow Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, and the sending of the disciples on their mission. And he centered the curriculum around these things, especially the Sermon on the Mount. Now, what his whole idea was that in what had happened in the Reformation was that Paul had been brought forward. And the Reformation doctrines were expressed in Pauline terms, justification by faith, etc. And those terms had become abstract. As Paul told them, they presupposed the narrative, what Paul had passed on to his congregations. But as they had been passed on from in the Reformation churches, they had lost the narrative. They had lost their concrete content and become mere abstractions, or they tended to. And so what he said is we need to go back to the Sermon on the Mount and to the Synoptic Gospels to get the concrete content of the gospel again. And this is what Luther could still presuppose coming out of monasticism, that is, the rigorous life of following Jesus, and then the wonderful discovery of justification by faith and of the gospel as sheer promise and gift of Jesus. When you've got the the rigorous life of following Jesus, the disciplined life of following, falls away, then all you're left with is principles, theological principles. And your faith becomes adhering to those principles. And as you see, when you've got this idea, that this bifurcated idea of Christian existence that puts faith over here and says, this is the matter of the heart, that we believe in Jesus, that we're saved by grace, and so on. And on the other hand, our life, our concrete life, takes the shape that's given to us in our place and time in history. What happens to the Sermon on the Mount, for example? Well, Jesus, is showing us what our lives really should be like. But of course, we can't live up to the Sermon on the Mount. We can't turn the other cheek, and we can't live that life. So the Sermon on the Mount functions basically to show us our sin. And our real life, we have to go out there, and because we know we're saved by grace alone, that allows us to go out and get our hands dirty in real life, to be really engaged with our society and to become servants and to our neighbors, and help to build our community and our society and to defend it from its enemies and so on and so forth. So you see, what happens is that the world utterly dictates the agenda for what your life is. And God's Word, including this central thing that Jesus taught us, the Sermon on the Mount, is negated, silenced. So Bonhoeffer saw, if you send out these young men, they're volunteering, and it's a very dangerous. Let me say this. First of all, I told you they had no guarantee of a salaried position. They were young men starting out in life. Many of them wanted to get married and start families. They were under suspicion of being unpatriotic, of being anti-German, of consorting with Germany's enemies. In the atmosphere of the time, very xenophobic atmosphere, it was a very costly decision for them to come and identify with the confessing church and go to a confessing church seminary. And besides that, when they started going out then and doing missions in congregations, and the graduates after the 6-month term at this seminary would go out, be assigned, they'd start working in these little villages in Pomerania, they started to be harassed by the Gestapo. And many of them saw the inside of Nazi prisons just for doing pastoral work, because they were outside the norm. They were outside the official channels, which couldn't be tolerated, of course, in a totalitarian state. So they were considered subversive, and so there was real suffering involved for these people. So these young men needed to be equipped. They weren't ready. And so this is why he designed the curriculum he did, looking at these basic parts from the Synoptic Gospel. And I'm just going to look at one here, just to give you a little taste of it. And many of you have seen me do this before, but some of you have not, so I'm going to do it again. When he talks about, you probably have heard the slogans, costly grace and cheap grace. And usually you hear, cheap grace means, that's laxity. That's, not preaching enough commitment. Too much grace and not enough commitment and sacrifice. And, that's usually the way it's been interpreted. That's because it's not Lutherans interpreting it. On the other hand, Lutherans say, what do you mean? Cheap grace is free. Costly grace, that's got to be wrong. So Lutherans don't like this book. Reformed like it, but they like it for the wrong reason. And so one of my jobs is to try to explain what he was doing there. Yeah, Michael?
Is there a direct parallel between cheap grace and costly grace and active and passive righteousness?
We'll talk about that in a minute, okay? That was a question actually John asked me yesterday, a similar question.
Great minds think alike.
I know, they do, yeah. So let me, this will be familiar now. So let me just talk about, back up a little bit and talk about something that's a little more familiar to us, works righteousness. And we all know this is wrong, works righteousness. And here's how it works. I'll make a little diagram. I use the little stick figures all the time. Here I am. And I have a principle. Here it is. I have a principle, and it's called the principle of works. That principle says, if I want to be just before God, I need to do good works. I need to be the right kind of person, lead the right kind of life, be an obedient child of God. This is the theology of the old Adam. All of us believe this theology deep in our hearts. This is what we have to do. You got to finally shape up, you know? And we know this, right? Like the lady in my congregation one time, and I drove by, happened to drive by the cemetery. I saw her out there by her husband's grave, so I stopped to talk to her. She's in church every Sunday, dear old lady, you know. And she says, oh, I know he's in heaven. He was such a good man. And you just thought, oh, come on. Don't you hear what we say in church? But that's what we believe deep down. We have this principle of works, and it's the way the whole world works, right? It's just like when if you get a job, you're given your job description, you better live up to that job description or you're going to have some problems, right? You may even lose your job. So, and if you do it really well, you get commended and you get raises and maybe promotions. That's the way the world works, right? So what do? I get busy and I activate this principle by doing good works. I do these good works, then I look at them and I say, see, that's me. I'm this guy. I do all this stuff. I'm here in church every Sunday, and I usher, once a month, and I'm this good family man, and I'm a good husband. I'm a faithful husband, and I pray every day, and And I say, here I am. I do good. So I'm righteous, right? I mean, we all know that's wrong, but that's plain. This is, you look at this, and what do you see here? What's the shape? Circle, right. Where did we see the circle before? Right. Turned in on ourselves, curved in on ourselves, Luther said. We are curved in on ourselves. So I'm making my decisions, and I'm making good decisions. We don't want to say these are bad decisions, right? I'm making good decisions, and I can show it in my life. I regard that and say, look, here is who I am before God. That's works righteousness. So we all understand that. Something's missing here. What's missing in there? Or who's missing? Yeah, Christ. What do you need him for? What do we need Jesus for? Well, he inspires us, or he tells us, gives us a good example, or maybe he gives us a little boost like the steroids, for the athlete or whatever. Whatever. Okay? All right, this is works righteousness. Now let's look at cheap grace. And again, I'm going to make my little stick figure here. And under cheap grace, very similarly, I have a principle. But in this case, I have a principle of grace. The principle of grace says, I'm saved by grace apart from works. Jesus did it all, so I'm saved by grace. So how do I put that principle into operation in my life? I put that principle in operation by forgiving myself. I apply the principle to me, myself. I know that works righteousness is wrong, 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 wrong. I'm saved by grace. I'm a good Lutheran. Put that in quotes, Lutheran in quotes, because I know this, and I apply it to myself. I forgive myself, and so then I know that I'm fine before God. And then what? You still don't have Christ. Well, yeah. What's the shape here? It's circular. I'm still curved in on myself. I'm deciding what's good for me. I'm in charge of the whole process. I have this principle that I have elevated, as Bonhoeffer says, now to the very level of God himself. It's become my God. Instead of Christ, I've got a principle. Instead of the incarnate Son of God, I have an abstract idea. And I apply it to myself. And what happens when somebody like Hitler comes along? Do I have any place to stand? No. Because I'm just all alone by myself with my own little principle of grace, but there's nothing real here. I'm not standing anywhere. There's no real, visible, however hidden under the cross, place to stand. Even when it's clear, and as it became clear very quickly, even to many of the disillusioned ones, that you are dealing here with radical evil that no Christian could consent to. Genocide, mass murder. But they had nowhere to stand. How do you stand when you've got this kind of a theology? You're all by yourself. It's just something, this little interior thing inside your heart. No matter how strong a conviction you have about this principle of grace, it's just air. It's just nothingness, and you end up getting swept up. Talk about the spirit. We talked about. Just think of the images you've seen of Nazi Germany, like the great Nuremberg rallies, where everybody is in uniform, everybody is conformed, everybody is part of this great, exhilarating experience that we finally can be proud of being Germans, and we have this great future, this millennial future ahead of us. Yeah. It was intoxicating, and you're completely prey to that. There's no way that you can stand against that wind blowing. You're blown along with it. And that's what happened in Germany. That's why Bonhoeffer said he brought his students together to listen to the Synoptic Gospels, so that we're not talking here just about a principle, an abstract doctrine, but the incarnate one, the incarnate, crucified, risen one. Because what he wanted to say is, and this is why he calls costly grace, and I'll have to get down here. Can you see if I do this? I want to put it all on one. Costly grace doesn't mean just grace with some commitment tacked onto it afterwards, and by golly, it's all by grace, but by golly, you better obey. And you better obey, you better become a good Christian now. And it's not that at all. It's something quite different. And again, I always have this problem, because I like to be visual and make diagrams, that it's really much easier to diagram heresy than to diagram sound teaching. Because the gospel, heresy is what we do because it's natural for us. And it's easy for us to understand. And this is the way we think all the time, But costly grace, this is what happens. And if we think about the narrative of the calling of the disciples, so here I am again. If you want to think about Levi, for example, where's Levi? This is just one sentence. Levi is sitting at his tax booth. Jesus walks by. He says to this guy, of course, he's a traitor. He's a chiseler. He's a cheat. He's a parasite. He's a thief. He walks by and he says, "Follow me." And Levi's reaction is, wow, now I know I am saved by grace alone. And I'm so grateful and so filled with joy about that I'm going to stay here and I'm going to live my vocation as a tax collector. But now, out of gratitude and joy that I know deep in my heart that I'm saved by grace alone, apart from any works that I do. Right? That's what Levi did, right? No. What did he do? Well, he just got up, didn't he? He left. He got up and he left. He put one foot in front of the other and just followed Jesus. Now, the point that Bonhoeffer makes here is that the gospel is not an abstract principle. The gospel is the incarnate one. And to have faith in the incarnate one means you must be associated with him. You have to be with him physically. It's very physical. It's very basic. We heard that last night from Tim. Jesus says, "Follow me." Jesus says, "Follow me." Let's just put Jesus here, and I'll just make a cross to stand for him. And I'm sorry, forget that. That's this way. That comes to me. This word comes to me. Now, if you think of this word, "follow me," is Jesus. Jesus is not giving Levi a program to fulfill, a list of requirements that he has to do. He's not telling him that, well, here you got to do this, then you got to do this, you got to do this, and And he's saying, well, now, really repent of your sins for sure. Feel really sorry. Confess your sins. Give your heart to me. And then now start doing this and this and this to show that you're... No. The only content here is Jesus himself. It is in the form of a command, that's true. But that command is actually Jesus giving himself to Levi. Levi sitting there, discovered in the midst of his real life, which is sordid, of course, like ours is. Levi is given, Jesus is simply saying, here, be part of me. Live my life. Follow me. Live my life. Here, I give you my life instead of this life. What does Levi do? Of course, he obeys. As I said, he doesn't change his heart. He can't. He doesn't do something that is impossible. In fact, what he does is there's an actual physical action. He's walking, he's following Jesus, but now what's happened is that Levi has died. He's died. His whole life is over with. The life that he chose for himself, his way of surviving, his way of thriving, his way of choosing what is good and evil for him, is at an end, and he has a new existence as non-reflective regard for Jesus. He doesn't see anything but Jesus. He's not observing his feet moving and saying, oh, look at me, now I'm following Jesus. Now, why don't you do the same as me and be as good as I am? He doesn't look at himself. He's not looking at himself anymore. He's not turned in on himself. He's looking at Jesus. He only sees Jesus. Jesus is his own life, his only life. This very flesh and blood life that Jesus is leading, that you know where it's headed, that's now his life. He doesn't have his own life anymore. So what Bonhoeffer says here is that, of course, if he had not gotten up, he wouldn't have known Jesus. Levi is living by faith alone in Jesus, apart from works of the law. He's living by faith alone in Jesus, but if he had not obeyed, he couldn't live by faith alone. Only the one who believes obeys. That's true. The word had to come. The word of the gospel by which Jesus gave himself to Levi. But the other is also true, Bonhoeffer says, only the one who obeys believes. So he's struggling in discipleship in this book that he published at the end of the time that he was doing this short period of time that he was teaching at this seminary. He struggles in those introductory chapters to restate the Reformation doctrine of justification by faith so that you don't fall back into this misunderstanding. He's restoring, I'll come to you, Michael, here a second. He's restoring what Luther and Paul could presuppose. Paul the Pharisee, Luther the monk. That is the vigorous life of following Jesus, and also looking back at Kierkegaard there in this work. But he's not doing it in order to restore. This is not a monastic reform, a classic monastic reform, which means that things have become lax, now we're going to tighten them up again.